Hey, this is Jeff, and we need to talk. I recently saw the latest of many social media reposts from left-leaning friends that basically say, if you still support Donald Trump after his latest gaffe, you're either too stupid or too evil to remain my friend. Well, I don't support Trump, didn't vote for him in 2016, and I don't plan to vote for him in 2020. But you know what else I don't support? Dehumanizing people because they don't share your opinion, especially when they're supposedly your friends. My gut reaction is, goodbye, and good riddance, you intolerant bully. And while I've never seen a right-leaning friend issue that kind of ultimatum to people who support a left-wing cause, if they did, I'd feel the same. Fortunately, it only takes a few seconds for the rational side of my brain to kick in, and I remember my new catchphrase, don't berate, educate, which I think Ellen DeGeneres handled perfectly when people gave her grief about having fun sitting next to W at a ballgame recently. None of which is what I wanted to talk about today, at least not directly. The reason I opened with that story is, the one thing in it that probably no one objected to or even noticed was the characterization of political thought as left-wing or right-wing. That one-dimensional model had its origins over 200 years ago, and most people now just take it for granted to the point that if I draw a picture, it may seem incredibly elementary, but you'll see why I'm drawing it in a minute. On a line from left to right, policies and opinions considered liberal cover a broad range to the left of the center point, while those considered conservative cover a similar range on the right, and obviously centrist is in the middle. The extreme ends of that spectrum are typified by communism on the far left and fascism on the far right. When it comes to more mainstream thinking, in a two-party system, which for all intents and purposes the United States is, those parties, by necessity, cover broad ranges that roughly correspond to liberal and conservative, sometimes overlapping into centrist, although it seems like not so much these days. So for convenience, we'll put Democrats and Republicans about halfway out each of their respective wings. Unfortunately, while that's convenient, it's also dangerously misleading. When you hear things like Democrats are shifting farther to the left or Republicans are shifting farther to the right, they're trying to describe trends that the limitations of a one-dimensional model simply can't accurately represent. Now, let's see what happens if we expand that model to two dimensions. We'll call the first axis economic liberty, by which I mean the degree to which you get to keep what you earn and spend, save, donate, or invest it as you see fit. Taxes are a big part of that, but more broadly, it's about free markets, the fiscal discipline and solvency of the state, as well as things like property rights and eminent domain. The other axis we'll call social liberty, the degree to which you're free to be who you are, say what you think, and decide for yourself what's best for the well-being of your body and mind. If we map the traditional one-dimensional left-right scale onto this two-dimensional model, we get a diagonal, like this. And right away, the flaws in the one-dimensional model are obvious. Communist regimes are historically among the most socially repressive governments ever to exist. They're really way down in this corner. And fascism, by definition, involves state control of the economy, industry, transportation, commerce, labor unions, and everything else that goes with it. It's in the same corner as communism. Even though they're typically portrayed as opposite ends of the spectrum on the one-dimensional model by politicians, from a citizen's perspective, on the two-dimensional model, they're functionally equivalent. What about the mainstream political parties? I'm skeptical that they ever fell precisely on that line. But even if you assume that they did at one time, they don't anymore. Let's say your top priority is balancing the budget, so you hold your nose and accept that some Republicans who supposedly share your economic values also come with a generous side helping of cultural oppression. Only too late do you realize that the last two Republican administrations increased the deficit more than the last two Democrats, and what you end up with is more in this area. Conversely, if civil liberties are your thing, you might feel forced to throw in your lot with the tax and spend crowd. And then you realize that the current crop of Democrats includes quite a few who want to control everything from what you eat and drink to what you say and who you associate with, and they're fanatically hostile to the right to keep and bear arms. So what you end up with is more down in here. Does that leave anybody who's actually on the traditional left-right line? Well, I guess there might be a handful of classical moderates who fall roughly in the middle of the graph. Hypothetically, there could be some theocrats who want the state to let you keep your money because then you'd be able to tithe more. Some self-described socialists may believe, incorrectly, that Marxism's economic controls can be divorced from its rigid political and social controls. But for all practical purposes, the answer is no. There's no real-world political philosophy or party that falls precisely on the traditional left-right line. However, the fact that the line is misleading isn't really the problem. The problem is, I think most people would want to be somewhere in the northeast quadrant of the graph, with more economic liberty and social liberty. A few traditional left-wing and right-wing people would prefer the northwest and southeast quadrants respectively, but most of your choices are clustered around the southwest quadrant, which I don't think anybody wants, other than those who have or aspire to political power. If you believe that clustering is an accident, you're being naive. If you believe it's inevitable and uncorrectable, I disagree with that too. So what can you do to correct it? Well, I always like to try new things, so how about a cliffhanger? In the next episode, I'll tell you how we can move toward the northeast quadrant, and if your current opinions are actually on the left-wing, right-wing line, why the northeast quadrant is where you really want to be. As always, feel free to like, share, and leave comments. And if you want to see where this is going, why don't you subscribe? And we'll talk again soon.